There comes a moment in life when a person begins to realize that the years behind him were not merely a passage of time, but a preparation. The trials, the victories, the disappointments, the lessons that could only be learned through living, all of them were shaping something deeper than success. They were shaping understanding. And for many people, that moment arrives in what we may call the second chapter of life, a season when the noise is less important, when appearances matter less, and when the soul begins to ask a far more important question: what am I now living for? This question is not a sign of weakness. It is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is, in fact, one of the healthiest signs a human being can experience, because the person who asks that question honestly is standing at the doorway of transformation. Not the shallow kind of transformation that changes only habits on the surface, but the lasting kind that changes direction, meaning, and destiny. The great tragedy of life is not growing older. The great tragedy is living without a definite purpose. A man or woman can endure hardship, loss, uncertainty, and even failure if there is a reason to keep moving forward. But without a clear purpose, even comfort can feel empty. Even freedom can feel confusing. Even retirement, which so many imagine as a reward, can become a burden if it is not connected to something meaningful. Your second chapter of life was never meant to be a waiting room. It was never designed to be a quiet fade into the background. It was meant to be a season of deliberate living, a season in which you no longer drift with the current, but choose your destination with wisdom, a season in which your years begin to work for you, not against you, a season in which the knowledge you have gained becomes fuel for a new mission. Definite purpose is one of the most powerful forces in human life. It organizes thought, it sharpens decision, it gives energy to the body and hope to the spirit. It does something extraordinary to the human personality. It turns scattered effort into focused action. It takes the fog out of the mind and puts strength into the heart. The person with a definite purpose may not have every answer, but he has direction, and direction, in the end, is far more important than speed. Too many people enter the later years of life believing their greatest opportunities are behind them. They speak as though life has already made its most important demands of them. They begin to live in memory rather than in vision, but nothing could be further from the truth. Some of the finest work a person ever does can begin after the age when society expects him to slow down. Why? Because by then, if he has learned from life, he possesses something rare: perspective. And when perspective is united with purpose, remarkable things begin to happen. A person with definite purpose wakes up differently. He walks differently. He thinks differently. He thinks differently. He no longer asks only, "How do I pass the day?" He asks, "What must I contribute? What must I build? What truth must I live? What example must I leave?" These are not small questions. They are the very questions that awaken dormant power in the human being. The second chapter of life can become the richest chapter of all, not because it is easy, but because it can finally become intentional, no longer driven by comparison, no longer distracted by chasing what others expect, no longer imprisoned by old disappointments. Instead, guided by a single, clear, worthy aim. And once that aim is fixed in the mind, life begins to gather around it. Thoughts align with it, actions begin to reflect it. The days stop feeling random. The years stop feeling heavy. Even ordinary moments begin to carry new meaning. So if you are standing at that point in life where you feel the quiet pull for something more, pay attention to it. That desire is not an accident. It may be the signal that your real work is now ready to begin. Not over, not finished, not fading, beginning. Because the person who discovers a definite purpose in his second chapter of life may finally become the person he was meant to be all along. There is a quiet and powerful truth that many people do not fully understand until later in life. Life does not shrink with age unless the mind first permits it to shrink. The passing of years, by itself, does not reduce the value of a human being. It does not cancel possibility. It does not erase usefulness. It does not silence the inner call to grow, to serve, to build, to become. In many cases, the later seasons of life are not a closing down at all. They are an opening up. They are an expansion of meaning, an expansion of awareness, and, if one chooses it, an expansion of purpose. Too often, society teaches people to think of aging as a gradual surrender. It presents a picture of life in which youth is the season of importance, Middle years are the season of labor, and later years are merely a time of waiting. Waiting for comfort, waiting for the days to pass, waiting for the body to slow, waiting for the body to slow, waiting for the world to move on without us. But that picture is false, and it is dangerous, because people frequently become what they expect. If a man believes his best years are behind him, he begins to behave accordingly. He withdraws. He lowers his vision. He stops planting because he assumes there is no longer time to harvest. Yet history, observation, and plain common sense tell us something very different. Some of the wisest, strongest, and most deeply satisfying contributions a person will ever make are often made after the age when others have begun to underestimate him. What changes in the later years is not necessarily potential, but perspective. In youth, energy may be greater, but judgment is often still forming. In middle life, responsibility may be heavy, but clarity is often interrupted by urgency, pressure, and competing demands. Then there comes a later chapter when a person has lived long enough to see how quickly time moves, how temporary many worries are, how empty shallow ambitions can become, and how deeply rewarding it is to live for something larger than oneself. That realization, if welcomed, does not diminish life. It enlarges it. It gives new weight to each hour and new value to each decision. A person who enters this chapter with awareness begins to see that age has not merely taken certain things away. It has also delivered treasures. It has delivered experience, which is a costly teacher, and therefore a valuable one. It has delivered endurance, the kind that can only come from surviving seasons that once seemed impossible. It has delivered discernment, the ability to separate what matters from what does not. It has delivered patience, humility, and often a greater compassion for others. These are not small possessions. They are the very materials from which a life of uncommon depth can be built. The tragedy is that many people never claim these riches. They continue measuring themselves by standards that belong to another season. They compare their present selves to younger versions of who they once were, and in doing so they overlook the unique strength available to them now. They mistake change for decline. They see gray hair where they should see evidence. They see slower pace where they should see evidence. They see slower pace where they should see steadier intention. They see fewer distractions where they should see the possibility for greater concentration on what is truly worthwhile. Life expands with purr. Pose because purpose reorganizes the whole human being. It gathers scattered thought and gives it a center. It gathers unused ability and gives it direction. It gathers memory, wisdom, pain, hope, and talent, and puts them to work toward a definite end. Without purpose, a person can have years and not know what to do with them. With purpose, even a limited number of years can become rich, focused, and extraordinarily productive. That is why it is so important to understand that the later chapters of life are not meant for passive existence. They are meant for intentional living. When a person discovers a reason to rise in the morning, something begins to happen inwardly. Energy that seemed lost begins to return. Interest awakens. The mind becomes more alert. One begins to think not merely about getting through the day, but about using the day. That is a tremendous difference. The day is no longer an empty container to be filled with distraction. It becomes an opportunity to express meaning. A person may begin mentoring others, starting a long-delayed project, learning a new skill, serving a community, deepening spiritual understanding, writing down lessons for future generations, or finally pursuing the worthy idea that had been buried under decades of duty. The specific form matters less than the inward shift. The shift is from drifting to directing, from existing to living deliberately. This is why we must be careful never to accept the common lie that personal growth belongs only to the young. Growth belongs to the living. As long as a person can think, choose, learn, love, contribute, and imagine, that person remains capable of growth, and growth is one of the great sources of human dignity. The older man or woman who continues to grow becomes a force of quiet inspiration. Such a person proves, not with slogans, but with life itself, that the spirit need not retie simply because the calendar advances. There is also a deeper freedom available in the second chapter of life. Many earlier pressures begin to lose their grip. The need to impress, to compete endlessly, to follow the crowd, to seek approval at every turn. These things often begin to fade for the person who has lived long enough to see their emptiness. And when they fade, space opens up. Into that space can come reflection, gratitude, creativity, service, and vision. A person may, for the first time, begin to ask the right questions. What is still mine to do? What good can I now do best? What example do I want my life to leave behind? What truth have I learned that must now be lived more fully? These are not the questions of a life winding down. They are the questions of a life becoming more honest, more focused, more meaningful. There is tremendous power in that transition. The later years can become a season not of less life, but of life more distilled, more deliberate, and more aligned with what truly matters. And when a person understands this, age no longer appears as a sentence of limitation, but as an invitation to rise into a fuller measure of wisdom, usefulness, and inner significance. There is a remarkable possibility hidden within what many people call the second chapter of life. It can become the most meaningful season a person has ever known. Not the loudest season, not the fastest, not the most crowded with ambition, noise, and endless activity, but meaningful in the deepest sense of the word. A season in which life is no longer lived merely by habit, pressure, or expectation, but by understanding. A season in which a person begins to see that the years behind were not only for survival or achievement, but for preparation. Preparation for clearer vision, stronger character, deeper gratitude, and more deliberate living. When people are young, they imagine that meaning will come automatically with success. They believe that if they reach a certain level of income, recognition, comfort, or security, they will naturally feel fulfilled. But life has a way of teaching otherwise. It teaches that success without meaning can feel strangely empty. It teaches that a full calendar is not the same as a full heart. It teaches that a person may spend years pursuing what seemed important, only to discover that the things most worth having cannot be measured by applause, possessions, or status. This realization, though sometimes painful, is also liberating. It clears the ground. It strips away illusion, and it prepares the soul for a different kind of life. That is why the second chapter can become so meaningful. By this stage, a person has usually seen enough of life to know that time is precious. He knows that delay has a cost. He knows that relationships matter more than appearances, that peace matters more than image, that contribution matters more than image, that contribution matters more than comparison. These are not ideas borrowed from books alone. They are truths tested by living, and truth that has been lived carries a weight and authority that theory alone can never provide. The most meaningful season of life is not necessarily the one with the greatest external momentum. It is the one in which the inner life begins to align with the outward life. In earlier years, many people are divided within themselves. They may do what is expected while secretly longing for something else. They may chase approval while neglecting conviction. They may work hard, sacrifice deeply, and fulfill many duties, yet still feel that some essential part of them remains unexpressed. Then, later in life, something begins to change. The noise starts to lose its charm. The race no longer seems so important. The soul begins to ask simpler and stronger questions. What matters now? What is still worth giving my life to? What kind of man or woman do I now choose to become? Those questions mark the beginning of a richer chapter, not because the answers come easily, but because the questions themselves are more honest. And honest questions open the way to meaningful answers. A person in this season may discover that the most important work left to do is not something the world will celebrate loudly. It may be mentoring a younger generation. It may be repairing broken relationships. It may be using earned wisdom to encourage others. It may be building something small but lasting, something rooted in service, faith, truth, discipline, or love. The world may call such work modest, but life often reveals it to be immense. One of the great advantages of the second chapter is perspective. Perspective changes everything. It allows a person to see beyond the temporary and recognize the permanent. It shows him that many of the things once feared were survivable, and many of the things once chased were forgettable. It teaches him that inner peace is not accidental, that purpose is not optional, and that joy is often found less in receiving than in giving. This is why many people who seem successful in their earlier years feel restless, while others with fewer outward accomplishments grow calmer, deeper, and more radiant with time. Meaning is not created by accumulation. Meaning is not created by accumulation 10. It is created by alignment with what is truly worthwhile. There is also a quiet courage required in this season. To make the second chapter meaningful, a person must be willing to let go of the false idea that life's best contributions belong only to youth. He must refuse the lie that usefulness ends when the first major career ends, or when children are grown, or when physical speed declines. Usefulness does not disappear when circumstances change. It simply takes new forms. In fact, the influence of a mature, purposeful life can be greater than ever because it comes with credibility. Words backed by decades of experience carry force. Kindness expressed through tested character carries strength. Calmness in the face of difficulty becomes an example. Wisdom shared at the right moment can alter the course of another person's life. Meaning also grows when life is lived with intention instead of drift. Drift is easy. A person can drift through later life by repeating routines, consuming distractions, revisiting old memories, and speaking only of what used to be. But intention transforms everything. Intention says, these years still matter. Intention says, I am still responsible for how I think, how I spend my days, what I cultivate, and what I leave behind. Intention turns ordinary mornings into opportunities. It turns experience into guidance. It turns age into stewardship. A person with intention no longer merely counts his years. He makes his years count. And there is something profoundly moving about a man or woman who becomes more purposeful with time. Such a person does not pretend that life has been easy. He has known loss, disappointment, uncertainty, and perhaps regret. But instead of allowing these things to harden or empty him, he uses them as material for wisdom. He becomes gentler without becoming weak, stronger without becoming harsh, clearer without becoming proud. That kind of maturity is one of life's rarest achievements. It cannot be purchased. It cannot be rushed. It must be formed. This is why the second chapter can become the most meaningful season of all. It is a season in which a person has enough history to be humble, enough experience to be wise, enough clarity to be focused, and enough remaining life to still act on what he now knows. It is not a season for retreating from significance. It is a season for retreating from significance. It is a season for redefining significance, and no longer by speed, applause, or outward display, but by truth, contribution, presence, and purpose. And once a person understands that, he no longer sees the second chapter as a fading light, but as a steadier flame, one capable of warming others, guiding others, and illuminating the path ahead with a kind of meaning that only time, reflection, and chosen purpose can produce. Definite purpose is one of the great dividing lines in human life. It separates motion from direction, activity from achievement, and existence from significance. A person may be busy every hour of the day, and yet accomplish very little that matters. Another person with a clear and definite purpose may appear to move more quietly, yet every thought, every action, and every decision begins to gather force because it is aimed at something specific. This is especially true in the second chapter of life, when experience, wisdom, and time can either be scattered in a dozen directions or concentrated toward a meaningful end. And when they are concentrated, life takes on a new power. Experience by itself is not enough. Time by itself is not enough. Time by itself is not enough. Wisdom, even, is not enough if it remains unused. Many people grow older with tremendous reserves of knowledge and insight, but without a definite purpose, those reserves remain dormant. They carry lessons that could guide others, talents that could still create value, and understanding that could bring light to difficult situations, yet none of it is fully activated because there is no chosen aim to organize it. It is purpose that gives these things a channel. It is purpose that gathers all the fragments of a life and directs them toward something worthy. In youth, a person may rely heavily on energy. In middle years, he may rely on duty. But in the second chapter, one of the greatest strengths available to him is perspective. He has lived long and upon. To see patterns. He has learned, often through hardship, what lasts and what fades. He has seen the cost of confusion and the value of clarity. If he now joins that perspective to a definite purpose, he possesses something very powerful indeed. He is no longer merely reacting to life. He is directing what remains of his time and strength with intention. Definite purpose gives direction to experience by transforming memory into mission. A person who has suffered disappointment can use that pain to comfort and guide someone else. A person who has made mistakes can use them to teach wisdom rather than repeat regret. A person who has spent years in work, family life, struggle, service, or study has accumulated a treasury of real understanding. But if that treasury remains locked away, it benefits no one. Purpose opens it. Purpose asks, "What can I now do with all I have learned? What good can come from all I have lived? What good can come from all I have lived? How can the roads I have traveled become a path for someone else?" This is where many people miss one of the greatest opportunities of later life. They assume that because certain forms of ambition no longer fit, there is nothing equally important to replace them. But life does not demand that the later years look exactly like the earlier ones. It asks for something better suited to the season. It asks for mature purpose. It asks for a conscious decision to invest experience where it can matter most. For one person, that may mean teaching. For another, mentoring. For another, building a project long delayed. For another, serving in quiet ways that deeply affect a family, a neighborhood, or a community. The outer form may differ, but the inner principle remains the same. Definite purpose gives form and usefulness to all that life has already taught. It also gives direction to wisdom. Wisdom is one of the rarest and most valuable possessions a human buy. Can acquire, yet wisdom without expression becomes like light hidden under cover. It may exist, but it does not illuminate. Many older men and women know things that younger people desperately need to understand. They know the danger of wasting years on resentment. They know the emptiness of living for appearances. They know the importance of character, of patience, of self-command, of choosing worthy goals. They know how quickly time passes. They know that small, daily choices shape destiny. These truths, when shared at the right time and in the right spirit, can change lives. But it takes definite purpose to bring wisdom out of silence and into service. Purpose says my life still has an assignment. Purpose says what I have learned is not only for me. Purpose refuses the temptation to retire inwardly. It refuses to believe that the best one can do now is merely remember the past. Instead, it turns wisdom outward. It asks how truth can be applied, not merely admired. It transforms insight into action. Then there is the matter of time. In the second chapter of life, time often becomes more visible. A person becomes more aware that the years are not unlimited. And strangely enough, this awareness can become one of life's greatest gifts if it leads to definite purpose. For when time is seen clearly, it is valued differently. The vague habit of postponement begins to lose its grip. The mind no longer says, someday, indefinitely. It begins to ask, what now? What is essential now? What deserves the years that remain? What must no longer be delayed? Without purpose, this awareness of time can create anxiety or passivity. A person may drift, filling the days with habit, distraction, or routine. But with purpose, the awareness of time becomes invigorating. It sharpens choices. It removes trivialities. It helps a person stop spending his energy on what no longer matter, as he becomes more selective, more intentional, and often more alive. A day is no longer something to pass. It is something to use. A week is no longer merely endured. It is directed. Time becomes a resource to steward rather than a burden to escape. This is one reason people with a definite purpose often seem younger in spirit than those without one. Their bodies may age, but their minds remain engaged because they are moving towards something. There is a current in purposeful living that animates the whole personality. It gives reason to learn, reason to rise, reason to care, reason to persevere. The person with a definite purpose is not merely occupied. He is aligned, and alignment creates energy that drifting can never produce. A life without definite purpose tends to scatter itself. Thoughts move in many directions. Efforts begin and stop. Emotions dominate judgment. Days feel disconnected from one another. But when a person chooses a clear and worthy purpose, all these things begin to gather around it. The mind starts noticing opportunities related to it. Experience starts making sense in light of it. Wisdom finds application through it. Time becomes structured by it. In this way, purpose does not merely add one more interest to life. It becomes the organizing principle of life. That is why definite purpose is so powerful in the second chapter. It redeems the past by using what has been learned. It dignifies the present by giving it direction, and it gives the future meaning by aiming it toward contribution, rather than drift. A person may not control every circumstance. He may not recover every lost year. But he can still decide what his experience will now serve, what his wisdom will now support, and what his remaining time will now be given to. And in that decision, scattered years begin to unite, quiet strength begins to rise, and the second chapter becomes not a lesser season, but a more directed, more useful, and more deeply significant one. Many people move through life as though they were leaves carried by a current, going wherever the pressure of circumstance, habit, or popular opinion happens to take them. They wake, work, react, worry, repeat, and call it living. Years pass in this manner not because they consciously chose such a path, but because they never truly stopped to choose any path at all. This is what it means to grow older. Accidentally, it is not merely to age in the physical sense, because everyone ages. It is to arrive at later years without having deliberately shaped the direction, meaning, or purpose of one's life. And that is one of the most common conditions in the modern world. A person can be intelligent and still live accidentally. He can be hardworking and still drift. He can be hardworking and still drift. He can be respectable, responsible, and outwardly successful, yet inwardly undefined. He may fulfill duties, meet expectations, solve problems, and maintain appearances, but if he has never settled the question of what his life is truly for, then much of his effort remains unorganized, and much of his potential remains unused. He is active, but not necessarily directed. He is moving, but not necessarily progressing in a meaningful sense. The difference between accidental living and intentional living is not always visible from the outside. Two people may appear to live similarly. Both may have careers, families, routines, and responsibilities. Yet one is being carried by the day, while the other is guiding the day toward a clear and chosen end. One reacts to circumstances. The other interprets circumstances in light of purpose. One asks, "What must I deal with today?" The other asks, "What kind of life am I building through today?" The other asks, "What kind of life am I building through today?" That difference may seem subtle at first, but over years it becomes enormous. It is the mesh between a life assembled by chance and a life shaped by design. Why do so many people grow older accidentally? In part because drift is easy. The world supplies endless distractions, endless demands, and endless ready-made patterns into which a person can fit without much thought. There is always another bill, another obligation, another entertainment, another social expectation, another reason to postpone deep reflection. And many people spend their strongest years responding to what is urgent rather than defining what is important. They survive, but they do not truly steer. They remain occupied but not awakened. They postpone the larger questions because smaller questions shout more loudly. There is also the influence of fear. Intentional living requires decision, and decision carries responsibility. Once a person says, "This is my purpose. This is what I mean to do with my life," he can no longer hide comfortably behind confusion. He becomes accountable to his own convictions. Many avoid that accountability by remaining vague. Vagueness feels safer because it protects a person from the risk of definite failure. But it also prevents definite success, definite growth, and definite meaning. The person who refuses to choose a direction may avoid some disappointments, but he also forfeits the deeper satisfaction that comes only from committed living. By contrast, intentional living begins when a person becomes willing to step out of drift and assume authorship of his days. He begins to understand that life will not automatically become meaningful on its own. Meaning must be chosen, pursued, and embodied. He realizes that his habits are shaping him, that his attention is training his mind, that his repeated thoughts are building his future, and that his time is too valuable to be surrendered entirely to impulse or routine. This realization is both sobering and liberating. Sobering, because it reveals how much can be lost through unconscious living. Liberating, because it reveals that a different way is still possible. Intentional living does not mean controlling everything. No one can do that. Life will always contain surprises, setbacks, losses, and changing conditions. But an intentional person is not defined by those things. He responds to them through the lens of a chosen purpose. He may be delayed, but he is not directionless. He may be wounded, but he is not empty. He may need to adapt, but he does not surrender the central aim that gives his life coherence. In this sense, intentional living is not rigidity. It is steadiness. It is the ability to remain aligned even when circumstances are unstable. This becomes especially important in the second chapter of life. A great many people reach later years and suddenly discover that much of their life was spent fulfilling roles without defining identity. They were busy being what others needed them to be, but they never fully answered the question of what they themselves were called to become. Then, when certain responsibilities, lesson and external structures begin to change, they feel a strange emptiness. They do not know what to do with freedom, because they have never trained themselves to live from inward purpose. The routines that once carried them are no longer enough, and for some, this becomes a crisis. For others, it becomes an awakening. The awakening begins when a person sees that the remaining years need not be left to chance. He need not continue drifting simply because he drifted before. He can begin now. He can become intentional now. He can say, "These years matter. This stage matters. My life is not over, and it will not be governed merely by habit, memory, or decline. I will choose how I think. I will choose who I serve. I will choose what I serve. I will choose what I build, what I see, contribute, and what kind of example I leave behind." That decision alone begins to transform a person from passive participant into deliberate creator. Intentional living affects every level of life. It changes the way a person uses his mornings. It changes what he reads, what he tolerates, what conversations he entertains, what goals he pursues, and what excuses he no longer accepts. It teaches him to measure opportunities not only by convenience, but by alignment. He stops asking only, "Can I do this?" and begins asking, "Should this have my time? Does this move me toward what matters?" These are powerful questions because they cut through the fog of meaningless activity. A person who lives intentionally also begins to see time differently. He understands that days are not interchangeable. Each one contributes to the architecture of a life. Each repeated action becomes a vote for the kind of person he's becoming. This awareness brings seriousness, but not heaviness. In fact, it often brings renewed vitality, because purpose energizes. When a person knows why he is living, decisions become clearer, distractions become easier to refuse. Even difficulties become more bearable because they are connected to a larger reason. Few live this way consistently, and that is why truly intentional people stand out. Not always by noise or status, but by clarity. There is something unmistakable about a person who knows what he is about. He may not speak loudly, he may not impress the crowd, but his life has direction, and direction gives dignity. He is no longer being pulled by every passing pressure. He is no longer growing older accidentally. He is growing older on purpose, and there is great power in that. For the person who lives intentionally does not merely accumulate years. He converts years into meaning, experience into wisdom, and daily choices into a life that bears the unmistakable mark of design. Rather than drift, a clear aim has the power to change the emotional climate of a person's life. It can take the heavy weight of regret and transform it into resolve. It can take the monotony of routine and turn it into progress. This is one of the great miracles of definite purpose. This is one of the great miracles of definite purpose. It does not erase the past, and it does not erase the past, and it does not remove every difficulty from the present, but it changes the meaning of both. It gives the past a use and the present a direction. And once a person experiences that shift, life begins to feel different from the inside out. Regret is one of the most common burdens of later life. Nearly everyone who has lived long enough has something he wishes he had done differently. Some regret wasted years. Some regret opportunities not taken, words not spoken, courage not shown, dreams postponed, talents neglected, or relationships mishandled. Regret by itself can be paralyzing. It keeps the mind looking backward, not to learn but to relive. It persuades a person that the most important chapters have already been written, and that whatever remains is merely aftermath. That is why so many people, even while still alive and capable, begin to think as though their useful life is already over. They become haunted by what might have been, and because of that, they fail to act on what still could be. But regret does not have to remain a prison. In fact, regret can become one of life's greatest teachers when it is met by a clear aim. The moment a person decides on a definite and worthy purpose, something begins to happen to all those old disappointments. They no longer remain dead weight. They become material. The pain of mischances can become urgency. The pain of mischances can become urgency. The memory of wasted time can become discipline. The sorrow of poor choices can become wisdom. Even failure, when faced honestly, can become a source of unusual strength. It can teach humility, compassion, perspective, and resolve. But this transformation only occurs when the person stops bowing to regret and starts directing his life towards something better. A clear aim says, "The past has taught me, and now I will use what it taught." That is a powerful declaration. It does not deny mistakes. It does not pretend there were no losses. It simply refuses to surrender the future to them. A person with a clear aim no longer asks only, "Why did that happen?" or "Why did I fail?" He begins to ask, "What can I now build because I have learned this? What can I now become because I have seen where drift leads? What can I still do with the time I have left?" Those questions move a person from self-reproach to responsibility, and that movement is the beginning of inner renewal. There is great dignity in this. A person cannot change yesterday, but he can change the meaning of yesterday by the way he lives today. If the lessons of pain lead to wisdom, then pain has not been wasted. If the memory of failure leads to steadier purpose, then failure has not had the last word. The person who discovers this truth becomes less interested in mourning the life he might have lived and more interested in faithfully living the life still before him. Regret loses its tyranny when purpose enters the picture, because purpose gives the heart somewhere to go. It also does something remarkable to routine. For many people, especially in the second chapter of life, routine begins to feel flat and repetitive. Days start blending into one another. The same tasks, the same hours, the same surroundings begin to create the feeling that nothing meaningful is happening. Life becomes predictable in the dullest sense. Life becomes predictable in the dullest sense. A person may wake, eat, move through the day, and return to bed having done many things, but advanced in nothing that deeply matters. This is not because routine itself is wrong. Routine is necessary. The problem is not repetition. The problem is repetition without direction. When routine is disconnected from a clear aim, it feels like maintenance. But when routine is connected to a clear aim, it becomes progress. That is one of the great secrets of purposeful living. The outer tasks may not change dramatically at first, but their meaning changes. A morning walk is no longer just a way to pass time. It becomes part of preparing the body to serve a mission. Reading is no longer mere consumption. It becomes training for clearer thought. Conversations are no longer casual exchanges alone. They become opportunities to encourage, influence, or learn. Saving money, managing health, writing notes, practicing skills, showing up consistently. These ordinary acts take on unusual force when they are tied to something definite and worthwhile. This is why two people can live almost identical days and yet experience them entirely differently. One feels trapped by routine, while the other is strengthened by it. One sees chores, the other sees building blocks. One feels that nothing is changing, while the other knows that every repeated act is contributing to something larger. The difference is aim. A clear aim redeems the ordinary by placing it in service of the meaningful. Human beings are not designed merely to endure time. They are designed to move towards something. Without that movement, the spirit begins to sag. Motivation weakens. Days become heavier than they should be. But when a person has a clear and worthy objective, even small efforts begin to matter. Progress may be gradual, but it is real. And real progress, however modest, has a strengthening effect on the soul. It reminds a person that life is still active, still responsive, still capable of growth. In the second chapter of life, this matters enormously. A person may know low, injure, be driven by the same ambitions that shaped earlier years, but he still needs direction. Without direction, freedom becomes emptiness. Without direction, time becomes a burden. But with direction, a new kind of vitality appears. The person begins to feel that his days are not merely passing, they are accumulating towards something. He begins to see that the later years can be deeply productive, not always in a public sense, but in a human sense. They can be years of contribution, years of refinement, years of influence, years in which the soul becomes more anchored and the life more deliberate. A clear aim does not need to be grand in the eyes of the world. It only needs to be real, worthy, and definite. It may be to mentor younger people, to write and preserve lessons learned, to strengthen one's family, to build a small work of service, to deepen one's character, to improve health for the sake of usefulness, or to devote oneself to truth in a deeper way. Whatever the form, the effect is the same. Life stops feeling random. Routine stops feeling empty. The day gains shape because the mind has a target. And once that happens, a person is no longer simply looking back at what was lost. He is now moving toward what can still be gained. He is no longer measuring himself only by old mistakes or mischances. He is measuring himself by present faithfulness. That is a far healthier standard, because it places power back where power belongs, in the choices being made now. And in that shift, regret becomes fuel, routine becomes structure, and the second chapter of life begins to reveal itself not as a slow decline into memory, but as a disciplined, meaningful advance, shaped by one clear, chosen, and deeply significant aim. The mind is always moving towards some picture, whether a person realizes it or not. It cannot remain empty for long. It either drifts toward images supplied by fear, doubt, habit, and outside influence, or it advances toward a vision deliberately chosen and consistently held. This is one of the most important laws of human life. The mind moves in the direction of its dominant image. It is drawn, shaped, and organized by the pictures it accepts as true and important. And in the second chapter of life, this principle becomes especially powerful, because what a person consistently sees within will largely determine how he lives without. Many people think their lives are governed mainly by external circumstances. They blame age, background, timing, the opinions of others, the economy, or the mistakes of the past. Certainly these things exert influence. No thoughtful person would deny that conditions matter. But conditions alone do not explain why two people facing similar outward realities can live in entirely different inward worlds. One grows discouraged, passive, and resigned, while the other becomes purposeful, inventive, and quietly determined. The difference often begins in the mind. More specifically, it begins with the image each person holds of himself, of life, and of what is still possible. A person acts in harmony with the picture most deeply impressed upon his mind. If he sees himself as finished, he begins to live like a finished man. If he sees his later years as a period of decline, irrelevance, and waiting, then his decisions, habits, conversations, and emotional tone will gradually conform to that expectation. He will not need anyone to force limitation upon him, because he will have accepted it inwardly. The human personality is remarkably obedient to the images it entertains. That is why hopeless thoughts are so dangerous. They do not remain thoughts for long. They become attitudes, and attitudes become actions, and actions repeated over time become a life. But the reverse is also true, and it is one of the most encouraging truths a person can discover. If a man begins to hold a clear, worthy, and consistent picture of purpose, contribution, growth, and usefulness, then his mind starts moving toward that image. His attention becomes more selective. He notices opportunities that previously escaped him. He begins to interpret events differently. He uses time differently. He speaks differently. He chooses differently. The body itself often responds to the mind's new direction, because enthusiasm, hope, and purpose have a strengthening effect on the whole being. The mind and life begin to cooperate. This is not magic, and it is not wishful fantasy. It does not mean that merely imagining a better life will produce one automatically. The image by itself is not enough. But without the image, the disciplined action needed for change rarely begins or endures. The picture in the mind precedes the pattern in the life. A builder first sees the pattern in the life. A builder first sees the structure before he raises it. A traveler first selects the destination before he can choose a road. In exactly the same way, a person entering the second chapter of life must begin by seeing clearly what he means to become and what he means to do. Without that inward picture, effort remains uncertain. With it, effort can become ordered and persistent. That is why vague desire produces so little. A man may say he wants peace, usefulness, health, discipline, or meaning, but if he has no definite picture of what these look like in daily life, his mind has nothing firm to organize around. He remains pulled by passing moods and circumstances. But when he forms a clear mental image of a purposeful life, perhaps of himself as calm, disciplined, strong in spirit, generous in action, intellectually alert, and devoted to a worthy aim, he gives the mind something definite to work toward. The repeated contemplation of that image begins to letter his behavior. Slowly, often, quietly, but genuinely. This principle explains why repeated negative thinking is so destructive. A person who constantly imagines failure, humiliation, weakness, rejection, decline, or uselessness is training the mind in a direction he does not want to go. He is rehearsing defeat. He is filling the inner field with seeds that, given time, will produce outward results. The mind does not remain unaffected by what it is repeatedly told. It accepts repetition as importance. What is held most consistently begins to seem most real. That is why casual exposure to discouraging ideas, cynical conversation, hopeless habits of speech, and self-defeating thoughts is more serious than many people suppose. These things are not harmless. They are impressions, and impressions become inclinations. In the later years of life, this becomes especially critical, because the mind often faces two competing pictures. One picture, supplied by society and by fear, says that the best is over, that strength belongs only to the young, that meaningful contribution is mostly finished, and that life now consists mainly in managing decline. The other picture says that experience has value, that wisdom can still guide, that purpose can still expand, and that these years can be deeply meaningful if directed with intention. Whichever picture a person repeatedly accepts will begin shaping his reality. He may not control every external condition, but he can decide which inward image he will nourish. The great men and women who remain alive in spirit during the second chapter of life are usually those who have learned to hold the right image before the mind. They do not deny difficulty, but they refuse to grant difficulty the final authority. They do not ignore aging, but neither do they interpret it as the end of usefulness. They keep before them the image of a life still under construction, a life still capable of giving, learning, becoming, and influencing. Because they hold that image, they continue to act in ways that support it. They read, reflect, serve, plan, grow, build, and contribute. The image is not an escape from reality. It is a better interpretation of reality, one that releases effort instead of surrender. This is why it matters so much what a person dwells upon each day. Thought is not merely a private pastime. It is formative. It is directional. It is creative in the sense that it helps shape character and conduct. The person who fills his mind with resentment will move toward bitterness. The person who fills his mind with fear will move toward bitterness. The person who fills his mind with a clear purpose and a worthy picture of what life can still become will move toward expansion. Little by little, the inner world sets the trajectory for the outer one. There is also a moral dimension to this. To hold the right picture consistently requires discipline. The mind will not do it automatically. Left unattended, it often wanders toward worry, memory, self-pity, or distraction. A person must therefore become a guardian of his own thought life. He must choose what he repeats to himself, what he reads, what voices he listens to, what atmosphere he allows into his consciousness. He must return, again and again, to the central picture of the life he means to live. This repetition is not weakness. It is training. Every noble life involves it, and in time, the effect becomes visible. The person grows steadier. His days acquire form. His efforts become less random. He does not rise each morning, asking merely what will happen to him. He rises remembering what he is moving toward. That quiet remembrance shapes the day before the day fully begins. It keeps him from being entirely ruled by mood or noise. It reminds him that he is not simply living from the past, but toward a chosen future. The mind moves toward the picture it holds most consistently, because human life is always seeking coherence between what is inwardly believed and outwardly lived. For that reason, one of the greatest gifts a person can give himself in the second chapter of life is a clear and worthy inward picture, held faithfully, nourished daily, and backed by action, until thought, habit, and character begin to align with it, and life itself starts to take the shape of that vision. When a person knows why he rises each morning, life changes at its core. The alarm may sound at the same hour. The room may look the same. The body may carry the same years, the same limitations, even the same aches and memories. Yet something essential is different. There is an inner reason for movement. There is a cause behind the effort. There is a destination behind the day. And that changes everything, because human beings were not designed merely to wake up and pass time. They were designed to move toward meaning. One of the great dangers in the second chapter of life is not physical age itself, but the quiet loss of inner necessity. Many people continue living, but they no longer feel summoned by anything. The days become repetitive. The calendar moves forward, but the spirit does not. There is no compelling reason to get up beyond habit, obligation, or survival. And when that happens, energy begins to drain from life. The body may still function, but the inward fire weakens. Motivation fades. Interest narrows. Even simple tasks begin to feel heavier than they should. This is not because the person is incapable, but because the human spirit needs a reason. It needs a purpose that gives shape to effort and significance to time. Energy is often misunderstood. People think of it only in physical terms, as though it were simply a matter of sleep, diet, age, or health. Certainly, these things matter. But there is another kind of energy, deeper and often more decisive. Psychological energy, spiritual energy, the energy that arises from meaning. A person who has a clear reason to live can sometimes carry burdens that would crush another person who lacks that reason. He can endure inconvenience, overcome discouragement, learn new things, adapt to change, and persevere through difficulty, because his effort is attached to something important. The body may become tired, but the will remains engaged. And where the will is engaged, surprising strength often appears. This is why purpose has such a powerful effect. When a man knows why he rises, he is no longer negotiating with life in the same way. He is not asking every morning, "How shall I endure another day?" He is asking, "How shall I use this day in the service of what matters?" That is a completely different posture. One is passive and wearying. The other is active and dignifying. One drains energy because it places the person in a defensive position before the day even begins. The other generates energy because it gives the day a mission. Think of the difference between obligation and calling. Obligation may force a person to act, but it rarely inspires him for long. Calling reaches deeper. Calling awakens something within. It reminds a person that his life is connected to something larger than comfort, routine, or self-concern. It gives him a reason to prepare, to improve, to remain alert. Even small acts begin to carry weight when they are connected to purpose. A morning walk is no longer merely exercise. It becomes preparation for usefulness. Reading is no longer a way to fill time. It becomes nourishment for thought. Conversation is no longer casual noise. It becomes a chance to encourage, teach, or serve. Purpose changes the meaning of ordinary things, and when meaning changes, energy changes with it. Many people in later life make the mistake of waiting to feel energetic before they choose a purpose. But in many cases, purpose is what helps restore energy. Not always all at once, and not in some magical sense, but steadily and genuinely. The moment a person commits himself to a worthy aim, the mind begins to organize around it. Attention sharpens. Interest returns. The heart becomes more engaged. The person starts noticing possibilities again. He begins to think beyond himself, beyond his complaints, beyond the empty repetition of days. And that outward movement of thought is itself renewing. It breaks the spell of passivity. This is one reason people who live with purpose often appear younger in spirit than others their age. Their circumstances may not be easier, their bodies may not be stronger, but their minds are alive because they are occupied with something meaningful. They are still becoming, they are still giving, they are still giving, they are still aiming. There is great vitality in that, not frantic vitality, not the restless energy of shallow ambition, but a steadier force, the energy of a person who has found a reason to keep contributing, keep learning, keep showing up. In the second chapter of life, that reason may look different than it did before. It may no longer be tied to career advancement, raising children, or meeting the urgent demands of earlier years. But that does not mean it disappears. It simply matures. It may now take the form of mentoring, serving, writing, building, teaching, creating, strengthening others, deepening character, preserving wisdom, healing relationships, or becoming a living example of truth and steadiness. The form matters less than the reality behind it. The essential question is whether the person has a definite why. Without that why, even freedom can become empty. With it, even modest circumstances can become rich in meaning. A person with a why also suffers differently. He still feels pain, disappointment, and fatigue. He is not exempt from loss, but he is less likely to be defeated by these things because they do not exist alone in his mind. They exist within a larger framework. Difficulty becomes something to work through, not merely something to complain about. Delays become part of the road, not proof that the road is pointless. The person with purpose interprets hardship differently because he is measuring life by contribution and direction, not only by ease. That alone preserves an enormous amount of emotional strength. There is also a discipline involved in keeping this energy alive. Purpose must be remembered. The mind must return to it daily. A person cannot drift all week in distraction and expect to feel the force of a meaningful life. He must remind himself what he is rising for. He must place before his mind the reason these days matter. He must connect actions to aim. This may be done through prayer, reflection, writing, reading, planning, or simply quiet thought at the start of the day. However, it is done. The principle remains the same. Energy returns when the inner reason is renewed, and perhaps that is one of the great privileges of the second chapter of life. A person now has enough experience to know that time is precious, and enough perspective to know that empty motion is not enough. He can choose, with deeper seriousness than before, what deserves his remaining strength. He can stop scattering himself. He can stop rising for vague reasons. He can stop rising for vague reasons. He can begin to rise for something clear, something worthy, something that justifies effort and gives dignity to the day. The world often underestimates the power of this. It looks for energy in youth, speed, novelty, and excitement. But some of the strongest energy in human life is found elsewhere. It is found in the quiet determination of a person who knows what his life is now for. It is found in the man who rises not because the world demands it, but because purpose calls him. It is found in the woman who has every reason to withdraw, yet continues to live because she knows her presence still carries value. This kind of energy is not borrowed from circumstances. It comes from meaning, and once a person discovers that, mornings are no longer merely the beginning of another cycle. They become a summons. The day is no longer something to get through. It becomes something to invest. Time is no longer an enemy to be endured. It becomes a field in which purpose can still be planted, cultivated, and shared. The person who knows why he rises each morning may still grow older in years, but inwardly he remains in motion, gathering strength from a clear reason, and drawing from that reason a renewed energy that gives shape, dignity, and living significance to every day he has been given.